The wooden board hung behind the bar like a monument to everyone's failures, each notch and scratch a testament to Teresa Paulson's iron memory and harder heart. She stood there in the late afternoon heat of June 1884, her dark hair pinned back severely, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she polished glasses that never quite seemed clean enough. Goldfield, Nevada was a town built on gold and broken promises, and Teresa had learned early that trust was a luxury she could not afford. Her father had left her this saloon when he died 3 years ago, along with debts that would have buried a weaker woman. She had paid them all, every cent, and in doing so had become someone harder than the girl who once believed people were fundamentally good. The board behind her was her own creation. Every drink given on credit, every meal served to a man who swore he would pay next week, every poker chip loaned with a handshake, all of it got scratched into that pine board in her careful, precise handwriting. Some folks called her heartless, others called her smart. Teresa did not much care what they called her, as long as they paid what they owed. The saloon doors swung open, and dust motes danced in the shaft of golden light that cut across the wooden floor. Teresa did not look up immediately. She had learned to read men by their footsteps, and these boots struck the floor with a confidence that usually meant trouble or a cattle buyer with too much money in his pocket. "Whiskey," the man said, his voice rough as gravel but not unkind. Teresa glanced up and found herself looking at a cowboy who seemed carved from the same sun-baked earth as the Nevada landscape itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dust covered his clothes, and he carried himself with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on horseback than on his own 2 feet. She guessed him to be around 25, maybe a year or 2 older than herself. "3 cents," she said, already reaching for the bottle. He laid a coin on the scarred bar top without complaint, and Teresa felt a flicker of approval. She poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass and slid it across to him. He caught it without looking, his eyes already scanning the room with the wariness of someone who had learned to watch his back. "Name is Samuel Merritt," he said after he had downed half the whiskey. "Heard there might be work around here. Cattle drives, ranch work, that sort of thing." Teresa wiped down the bar even though it did not need it. "Depends what you can do. Henderson Ranch is always looking for hands, but old man Henderson does not pay much and works you hard. The Carmichael spread pays better, but they are particular about who they hire." Samuel finished his whiskey and set the glass down gently. "Appreciate the information. You're the owner here." "I am." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the board behind her. She saw his eyes narrow slightly as he took in the names and amounts scratched into the wood. Some of the entries were months old, others weeks. The oldest debt listed was from more than a year ago Bill McKinnon, who owed her $12 for a week of meals and lodging before he disappeared into the hills. "That is quite a collection," Samuel said carefully. Teresa's jaw tightened. "It is quite a lot of money owed to me. People in this town seem to think kindness means I will forget what they owe. I do not forget. I can see that." There was no judgment in his tone, just observation. "Must be hard keeping track of all that. Not hard at all when you write it down." She picked up his empty glass. "Another," he shook his head. "Need to find a place to stay and see about that work. Henderson Ranch, you said, 5 miles south. Follow the creek until you see the cottonwoods, then head west." Samuel tipped his hat to her, a gesture so natural and polite that Teresa felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. She crushed it immediately. Polite men were often the most dangerous kind, because they made you want to trust them. She watched him leave, his silhouette disappearing into the bright afternoon, And then she turned back to her glasses and her board and her careful accounting of everything the world owed her. 3 days passed before she saw him again. In that time, Teresa had added 2 more names to her board: Tommy Carson for $1.20 in drinks, and Martha Webb for $3 she had borrowed for her son's medicine. Teresa had wanted to refuse Martha, had felt the word no forming on her lips, but something in the older woman's desperate eyes had broken through her defenses. She hated that weakness in herself, that small, soft spot that could still be exploited. When Samuel Merritt walked back through the saloon doors that Friday evening, he looked cleaner but more tired. He had the lean, weathered look of a man who had been working hard under the desert sun. "Whiskey," he said again, and this time when he laid his coin on the bar, Teresa noticed the calluses on his hands were fresh, the kind that came from rope work and hard riding. "Henderson hire you?" she asked, pouring his drink. "He did. Pay is not much, like you said, but it is honest work." He took a sip, savoring it this time instead of downing it in one gulp. "Came to town with some of the other hands. They are playing cards in the back, if you do not mind." "I do not mind as long as they pay for their drinks." Teresa paused. "And as long as they actually pay before they leave, not on promises." Samuel's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "I will make sure of it." He was true to his word. When his companion's 3 rough-looking ranch hands named Pete, Dutch, and Carson came stumbling out 4 hours later, Samuel quietly settled everyone's tab before they left. Teresa watched him count out the coins with the same care she herself used, making sure every cent was accounted for. "You did not have to do that," she said as the others headed for the door. "They are grown men. They should pay their own way." "True enough," Samuel agreed, "but Pete just sent most of his pay home to his mother in Colorado, and Dutch has been saving for a horse. Easier this way. And now they owe you instead of me." "I suppose they do, but I do not keep a board." Teresa felt her defenses prickle. "That board keeps me in business, keeps me from being taken advantage of." "I was not criticizing," Samuel said quietly, "just stating a fact. Everyone has their own way of managing the world." He left before she could formulate a response, and Teresa found herself staring at the closed saloon doors long after he had gone, wondering why his words felt like they had lodged themselves somewhere under her ribs. Summer deepened, and with it came the relentless heat that made Goldfield shimmer like a mirage in the afternoons. Teresa's saloon became a refuge for men seeking shade and cold beer, and business was good. The board behind her grew more crowded with names and numbers, a growing tally of obligations unfulfilled. Samuel came to town most Fridays with the Henderson ranch crew. He always paid for his own drinks promptly, and more often than not, he quietly covered the tabs of men who were short on funds. Teresa noticed, though she pretended not to. She noticed other things too: the way he never got drunk even after several whiskeys, the way he listened more than he talked, the way his eyes would find hers across the crowded room and hold her gaze for just a moment before looking away. It irritated her, that awareness. She did not have time for such foolishness. One evening in late July, when the heat had driven most people into lethargic stillness, Samuel was the only customer in the saloon. He sat at the bar nursing a beer, and Teresa found herself talking to him more than she usually talked to anyone. "Why Goldfield?" he asked. "This town is not much to look at." "It is home," Teresa said simply. "My father won his claim here back in '78, made enough to buy this place. He always said the real gold was not in the ground, but in serving the men who dug for it. Smart man. Smart enough." Teresa wiped down the bar in smooth, practiced strokes. "He also trusted too easily, loaned money to friends who never paid him back, extended credit to people who skipped town." When he died, I inherited his generosity along with his debts. And you decided to be different. I decided to survive." The words came out sharper than she intended. "That board represents 3 years of making sure I never end up buried by other people's promises again." Samuel was quiet for a moment, turning his beer glass in slow circles on the bar top. "My father was a gambler," he said finally. "Lost everything we had on cards and bad horses. My mother worked herself to death trying to keep food on the table for me and my sisters. When he finally drank himself into the grave, I swore I would never be the kind of man who put his own wants above other people's needs." Teresa felt something shift in her understanding of him. "Is that why you pay for the others?" "Partly. Also because I know what it is like to be short, to feel the shame of not being able to settle up. If I can spare someone that feeling, I will. That is going to leave you poor. Maybe, but I sleep all right at night." The implication hung in the air between them, and Teresa felt her cheeks warm with something that might have been shame or might have been anger. "I sleep fine too." "I did not say you did not." Samuel finished his beer and stood. "Just different ways of managing the world, like I said before." After he left, Teresa found herself staring at the board with new eyes. She saw Bill McKinnon's name and remembered how his wife had cried when he left, how their children had gone hungry. She saw Tommy Carson's debt and recalled that he was barely 18, working for pennies at the livery stable. She saw Martha Webb's name and thought of medicine and desperation, and the way some choices were not really choices at all. Then she shook her head hard, as if to dislodge those thoughts. The board was necessary. The board kept her safe. The board was all that stood between her and the kind of ruin her father had courted with his soft heart. August brought dust storms that turned the sky brown and coated everything in grit. Business slowed as people stayed indoors, and Teresa found herself with too much time to think. She caught herself watching for Samuel on Fridays, caught herself feeling disappointed when he did not show up one week, because Henderson had sent the crew to the far pastures. When he finally returned, she poured him a whiskey before he even asked. "On the house," she said, the words foreign in her mouth. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You feeling all right, Teresa?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt the sound of it do something strange to her heartbeat. "I can spare one whiskey. I would rather pay." "Do not want to end up on your board." "You would not. You always pay your debts. So do you, from what I hear. Paid off your father's obligations in full when you could have claimed bankruptcy." Teresa shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. They were legitimate debts. Someone had to honor them. Not everyone would have. Samuel sipped the whiskey slowly. "That takes integrity or stubbornness, maybe both." His eyes, gray and steady, held hers. "You are not as hard as you pretend to be, Teresa Paulson. You do not know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not, but I would like to." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Teresa was not sure she wanted to examine. Before she could respond, the saloon doors burst open and Pete stumbled in, his face pale and his shirt soaked with blood. "Samuel," he gasped. "We need help. Dutch got thrown from his horse and he is hurt bad. We got him to the boarding house, but Mrs. Chen says he needs a doctor and we do not have the money for Doc Pritchard's fee." Samuel was already moving, pulling coins from his pocket. Teresa watched him count out what he had not nearly enough for Doc Pritchard, who charged premium rates and never extended credit. "How much do you need?" she heard herself ask. Pete looked at her with desperate eyes. "Doc Pritchard wants $10 up front." $10. A fortune to men who made $30 a month. Samuel had maybe $3 in his hand, and Teresa could see the frustration and helplessness warring in his expression. She walked to her cash box, feeling like she was watching herself from a great distance. Her hands moved of their own accord, counting out $7 and adding them to Samuel's 3. "Go," she said. "I will add it to the board if he does not make it." Samuel's eyes met hers, and something passed between them that needed no words. Then he and Pete were gone, racing toward the boarding house where Dutch lay bleeding. Teresa stood alone in her empty saloon and tried to tell herself she had just made a business decision, that the debt would be repaid, that she was not being foolish. But her hands shook as she picked up her knife and carved a new entry into the board. Samuel Merritt, $7, August 15, 1884. Dutch survived, thanks to Doc Pritchard's quick work removing a piece of broken rib that had punctured his lung. He was laid up for weeks, unable to work, and Henderson reluctantly kept him on the payroll out of basic decency. Samuel came to the saloon the following Friday and laid $7 on the bar without a word. Teresa stared at the money. "That was fast. I do not like being in debt." "Most men would have taken longer to pay. I was not expecting it for months, if ever." "I am not most men." Samuel paused. "Can I buy you a drink, or would that complicate your bookkeeping?" Despite herself, Teresa smiled. "I suppose I can make an exception." They sat together at a corner table while the saloon filled with the usual Friday crowd. Samuel told her about growing up in Missouri, about his sisters who had married farmers and seemed happy enough, about the restlessness that had driven him west. Teresa found herself talking about things she never discussed, about her mother dying when she was 12, about learning to run the saloon while other girls her age were learning to sew samplers, about the loneliness of being the person everyone owed money to but no one quite trusted. "They think you are cold-hearted," Samuel said, "but I think you are just tired of being hurt." Teresa looked down at her hands, calloused from years of hard work. "My father used to say I had a good heart. I think he would be disappointed in what I have become. Or maybe he would understand that you did what you had to do to survive." Samuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was gentle, tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. "I do not know how to be soft anymore," Teresa whispered. "I do not know how to trust. Maybe you could practice. Start small." "Start with what?" "Start with believing that I mean it when I say I want to know you better. Not the woman who keeps the debt board, but Teresa. The real you underneath all that armor." Teresa felt tears prick at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She had not cried in 3 years, not since her father's funeral, and she was not about to start now in front of a saloon full of customers. But Samuel saw anyway. He squeezed her hand gently and then let go, giving her space to collect herself. "Think about it," he said softly. "I am not going anywhere." Over the next few weeks, Teresa did think about it. She thought about it while she worked, while she carved new debts into the board, while she lay awake at night listening to the wind howl across the desert. She thought about the way Samuel looked at her, like she was something precious rather than something to be wary of. She thought about his hands covering hers, about the gentleness in his voice, about the way he paid his debts but never made her feel small for demanding payment. September came with cooler temperatures and the promise of rain that never quite materialized. Samuel continued to come to town every Friday, and Teresa found herself looking forward to those visits with an intensity that frightened her. They talked about everything and nothing: books they had read, places they wanted to see, dreams they had mostly given up on. One evening, Samuel arrived with a package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the bar with a shy smile that made him look younger. "For you," he said. Teresa unwrapped it carefully, conscious of his eyes on her. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind with thick, creamy pages meant for important writing. On the first page, in careful script, Samuel had written, "For keeping track of the good things, not just the debts." Teresa ran her fingers over the smooth leather, emotion welling up in her throat. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything. I just thought maybe it would be good to balance the ledger, so to speak. Write down the things people do right, not just what they owe. I would not know where to start. Start with today. Write down that a cowboy gave you a journal and meant it kindly. Teresa looked up at him, at the honesty in his gray eyes, and felt something inside her crack open. Why are you doing this? Why do you care? Because I have been falling in love with you since the first day I walked in here, Samuel said simply. And I think maybe, underneath all that fear and all those defenses, you might be falling a little bit in love with me too. The saloon noise faded to nothing. Teresa could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 3 years of loneliness pressing against this moment of possibility. I am not good at this, she said finally. At trusting, at letting people in. I know, but I am patient and I am not going anywhere. Samuel reached across the bar and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. Let me prove it to you, Teresa. Let me show you that not everyone leaves, that not everyone breaks their promises. And if I cannot, if I am too broken. You are not broken. You are just careful, and careful is all right with me. Teresa closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand still lingering against her cheek. When she opened them again, she had made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Come to dinner tomorrow, she said. I have rooms above the saloon. I will cook and we can talk. Just talk. Samuel's smile could have lit the whole desert. I would like that very much. The next evening, Teresa found herself nervous in a way she had not been since she was a girl. She cooked chicken stew and cornbread, set the small table with her mother's old dishes, and changed her dress 3 times before settling on the simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes. When Samuel knocked on the door, she nearly lost her courage and pretended she was not home. But she opened the door, and there he was, clean-shaven and dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, holding a bouquet of wildflowers that must have taken him an hour to gather from the desert scrubland. You look beautiful, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe it. They ate dinner and talked as the sun set beyond the window, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple. Samuel told her about a horse he was saving to buy, a beautiful paint mare that Henderson had agreed to sell him at a discount. Teresa talked about her dream of maybe expanding the saloon someday, adding rooms for travelers, making it into a proper inn. You have a good head for business, Samuel said. You could do it if you wanted. It would take money, more than I have after paying off all my father's debts. But you did pay them. That is what matters. Teresa set down her fork, studying him in the lamplight. Why do you keep doing that, reminding me of the good things I have done when all I can see are my failures? Because someone should, and because they are not failures, Teresa. You survived. You built something from nothing. You kept your integrity even when it cost you. He reached across the table and took her hand. That is not failure. That is strength. Teresa felt tears slip down her cheeks before she could stop them. Samuel stood and came around the table, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. She stiffened for a moment, unused to being held, but then she let herself relax into his embrace. Let herself feel the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her ear. I am afraid, she whispered into his shirt. I am afraid of needing you. I know, Samuel murmured into her hair, but need is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it just means you are human. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other as the darkness deepened outside. When Samuel finally pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that Teresa felt something inside her surrender. I am going to kiss you now, he said softly, if that is all right with you. Teresa nodded, not trusting her voice. Samuel bent his head and pressed his lips to hers, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. It was Teresa's first real kiss, and it felt like falling and flying at the same time, like the world had narrowed to just this moment, just this man, just this feeling of being cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I am falling in love with you, have been for months now." "I think I am falling in love with you too," Teresa admitted, "and it terrifies me." Love is supposed to be a little terrifying. Means it matters. They spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing and making plans in the careful way of people who were just beginning to believe in a shared future. When Samuel finally left, well after midnight, Teresa stood at her window and watched him ride away into the darkness, her lips still tingling from his kisses, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. She opened the journal he had given her and wrote her first entry. September 12, 1884. Samuel Merritt kissed me tonight, and I let myself believe in happiness again. The next few months passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing love. Samuel came to town whenever he could, and Teresa found herself smiling more, softening in ways she had thought impossible. The board behind the bar still held its list of debts, but she stopped adding to it quite as religiously. When Tommy Carson came up short on his tab, she let it slide for a week. When Martha Webb needed to borrow more money for her son's medicine, Teresa lent it without demanding immediate repayment. Samuel noticed, of course. He noticed everything about her. "You are changing," he said one evening in October as they walked along the edge of town under a sky full of stars. "Letting go a little. Is that a good thing?" "I think it is a very good thing." He pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You seem happier." "I am happier. You make me happy." The admission still felt strange on her tongue, but it was getting easier each time she said it. "Good, because I have been thinking about our future." Teresa's heart stuttered. "What kind of future?" Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "The kind where we build a life together. Where maybe I buy that paint mare and start building my own herd. Where you expand the saloon like you have been dreaming about. Where we wake up next to each other every morning and face whatever comes as a team." "Samuel Merritt, are you proposing to me?" "Not yet. I do not have a ring, and I want to do it properly." He smiled, that crooked smile that made her knees weak. "But I am giving you fair warning that I intend to propose, probably sooner rather than later. So you should start thinking about your answer." Teresa laughed, the sound bright and free in the desert night. "I do not need to think about it. My answer is yes. It will be yes whenever you ask." Samuel swept her into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Teresa thought she might burst from the sheer joy of being loved and loving in return. "We should tell people," Samuel said when they finally came up for air. "Make it official." "We should wait until you have that ring," Teresa teased. "People will talk if we announce an engagement without proper proof." "People will talk anyway. It is a small town." "True enough." They made their way back to the saloon, hand in hand, planning and dreaming. Teresa felt like she was floating, like the world had been repainted in brighter colors. She had spent so long protecting herself, building walls, keeping score of every slight and every debt. And now here was Samuel, offering her a future based on trust and love and the belief that people could be good. It should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. November brought cold winds and the first real rain Goldfield had seen in months. The creek rose, and the desert bloomed with unexpected color. Samuel spent his savings on the paint mare and began making plans to start his own small ranch on land he could lease cheaply from Henderson. Teresa started pricing lumber and drawing up plans for adding rooms to the saloon. Everything was falling into place like pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. And then Bill McKinnon came back to town. Teresa saw him first, riding down the main street on a horse too fine for a man who had skipped out on his debts. He looked prosperous, well-fed, wearing new clothes and carrying himself with an arrogance that made her blood boil. He tied his horse outside the saloon and walked in like he owned the place, like he had not left his family destitute while he owed Teresa $12. "Well, well," he said, grinning broadly. "The place looks good, Teresa. You have done well for yourself." Teresa set down the glass she had been polishing with deliberate care. "Bill McKinnon, I did not think you would have the nerve to show your face here again." "Now, is that any way to greet an old customer?" He leaned against the bar, still grinning. "I have been working up in Virginia City, made a fortune in the silver mines, came back to settle some old business. You mean the $12 you owe me, among other things." He pulled a thick wallet from his pocket and made a show of counting out bills. $12, was it? Here is 20. Keep the change for your trouble." Teresa looked at the money like it was a snake. Every fiber of her being wanted to snatch it up, to cross his name off her board, to settle the debt that had been eating at her for over a year. But something about his smug expression, about the way he was trying to buy his way back into respectability, made her hesitate. "Where is your wife, Bill? Your children?" His grin faltered slightly. "Mary took the kids and moved back to Missouri to live with her sister, said she could not forgive me for leaving like I did. Can you blame her? I sent her money once I started earning, sent her plenty. But she was too proud to take it, said I had made my choice." He pushed the money toward Teresa. "Point is, I am back now and I am settling my debts. That is what matters, right?" Teresa stared at the money, feeling the weight of the moment. A year ago, even 6 months ago, she would have taken it without hesitation. Debts were debts, and payment was payment. But now, looking at Bill McKinnon's self-satisfied face, all she could think about was Mary McKinnon crying in the street, about 3 small children going hungry because their father had chased easier money elsewhere. "No," she said quietly. "No." Bill looked confused. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean I do not want your money, not anymore." "That is crazy. You have been keeping score for over a year. Everyone in town knows about your damn debt board. Maybe I am tired of keeping score." Teresa reached behind her and found the board, lifting it down from its place on the wall. The wood was heavy in her hands, covered with names and numbers, a catalog of disappointments and broken promises. She looked at Bill McKinnon's name, scratched deep into the grain, and felt nothing but weariness. "You do not get to buy your way out of what you did," she said. "You do not get to waltz back in here and pretend money fixes abandoning your family. Mary and those children deserved better than you, and no amount of money changes that. I am trying to make it right." Bill's face was turning red. "I am trying to pay what I owe." "You owe a lot more than $12, and we both know it." Teresa held the board tighter, her knuckles white. "Now get out of my saloon. You are going to regret this. Everyone will hear about how you turned down good money because of some moral high-ground nonsense. Let them hear." "I do not care anymore." Bill grabbed his money off the bar and stormed toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. Just as he reached it, Samuel walked in and the 2 men nearly collided. Samuel stepped aside politely, but his eyes tracked Bill's angry exit with concern. "What was that about?" he asked, coming to the bar. Teresa was shaking, adrenaline and emotion coursing through her. "Bill McKinnon came back to pay his debt. I told him I did not want his money." Samuel's eyebrows rose. That must have been hard. It was. It was also the right thing to do. Teresa looked down at the board in her hands at all the names and numbers that had defined her life for 3 years. Martha Webb, Tommy Carson, Pete Anderson, Dutch Callahan, dozens of others, some paid, some still outstanding, all of it adding up to a weight she was tired of carrying. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked softly. Teresa met his eyes, those steady gray eyes that had seen past her defenses from the very beginning. "I am thinking this board represents everything I was trying to protect myself from: pain, disappointment, being taken advantage of. But it also represents me never moving forward, never letting go, never trusting that people can be better than their worst moments. You do not have to carry it all anymore, Teresa. I know." She looked at the board one more time, at the careful notches and scratches, at the permanent record of every time someone had failed to keep their word. Then she looked at Samuel, at the future they were building together, at the possibility of a life not defined by debt and bitterness. She walked to the door and out into the street with Samuel following. The afternoon sun was bright, and a few people were going about their business, paying her no attention. Teresa held the board with both hands, feeling the weight of it, the history of it, the way it had both protected and imprisoned her. "I do not need this anymore," she said, more to herself than to Samuel, and then she brought the board down hard against her knee. The wood resisted for a moment, and then with a sharp crack, it broke clean in half. Names and numbers split apart, debts severed, the careful accounting of 3 years rendered meaningless in one decisive snap. Teresa stared at the 2 pieces of wood in her hands, and then she started to laugh. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, a release of tension and fear and all the weight she had been carrying. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, until Samuel was laughing too, until she had to lean against him for support. "I cannot believe I just did that," she gasped. "I can," Samuel said, wrapping his arms around her. "You are the bravest person I know, or the craziest. Maybe both." He kissed the top of her head. "What are you going to do with it now?" Teresa looked at the broken pieces of board, then walked over to the trash pile behind the saloon and tossed them in without ceremony. 3 years of careful record-keeping, gone in an instant. It should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like freedom. "I am going to stop keeping score," she said, turning back to Samuel. "I am going to trust that most people are doing their best, and if they cannot pay me right away, that is all right. I am going to believe in second chances and fresh starts, because someone believed in me enough to show me I could change." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her properly, right there in the street where anyone could see. Teresa kissed him back, not caring who was watching, not caring about anything except this moment and this man and this new chapter of her life that was just beginning. When they finally broke apart, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I was going to wait, do this properly over dinner with candles and everything, but this feels like the right moment." Teresa's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the sunlight. "Teresa Paulson," Samuel said, dropping to one knee right there in the dusty street. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, based on trust and love and believing the best in each other?" "Yes," Teresa said, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Samuel slipped the ring on her finger and stood, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around while a few townspeople stopped to stare and then began to applaud. Teresa buried her face in his shoulder, overwhelmed by happiness, by the realization that she had spent so long protecting herself from pain that she had almost missed out on this incredible feeling of being loved completely. "I love you," she whispered into his ear. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," Samuel murmured back, And we are going to be so happy together, Teresa. I promise you that." They spent the rest of the day making plans and sharing their news. Teresa closed the saloon early, something she had never done before, and they went to dinner at the boarding house where Mrs. Chen made a fuss over Teresa's ring and promised to make them a wedding cake. They told Henderson, who congratulated Samuel gruffly and said he supposed he could spare him for a honeymoon if he promised to come back and work. They told Pete and Dutch and the other ranch hands, who insisted on buying rounds of drinks to celebrate. By the time they made it back to Teresa's rooms above the saloon, it was late, and they were both giddy with happiness and exhaustion. Samuel kissed her goodnight at the door, proper and respectful despite the desire Teresa could see in his eyes. "Soon," he said, stroking her cheek. "Once we are married, I will never have to leave you at this door again." "How soon can we make that happen?" Teresa asked, only half joking. "How about Christmas? That gives us 6 weeks to plan, for you to get a dress, for me to find us a place to live. 6 weeks sounds perfect." They kissed again, long and sweet, and then Samuel forced himself to pull away and head back to the ranch. Teresa stood in her doorway watching him ride off into the darkness, her ring catching the lamplight, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. She went inside and opened the journal Samuel had given her, turning past the first entry to a fresh page. She wrote, "November 18, 1884. I broke the debt board today. Samuel proposed. I said yes. I am learning what it means to be truly free." The next 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Teresa ordered a dress from the catalog, a beautiful cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Samuel found a small piece of land with a cabin on it that they could afford to buy, and spent every spare moment fixing it up, making it into a home. They decided to keep the saloon running, with Teresa managing it during the day while Samuel built up his horse herd. The town seemed genuinely happy for them. Martha Webb gave Teresa a beautiful quilt she had sewn herself. Tommy Carson offered to help Samuel with the heavier work on the cabin. Even old man Henderson, who never showed emotion about anything, clapped Samuel on the back and said he had chosen well. There were a few sour notes. Bill McKinnon spread rumors that Teresa had lost her mind, and a couple of the men who still owed her money tried to take advantage of her new softness, but Teresa found she did not care as much as she once would have. She simply told the ones who tried to cheat her that she expected payment when they could manage it, and she trusted them to be honest. Most of them were. December arrived with cold winds and even a light dusting of snow that melted by midday but left everything fresh and clean. Teresa had never been one for sentimentality, but she found herself getting teary-eyed over the smallest things, the way Samuel looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, the way he had carved their initials into the beam above the cabin door, the way he insisted on carrying her over every threshold they crossed together for practice. The wedding was set for December 22nd, giving them a few days before Christmas to settle into married life. Teresa could hardly sleep the night before, her mind racing with excitement and nerves and disbelief that this was actually happening, that she was actually going to marry this good, kind man who had seen past her defenses and loved her anyway. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the Nevada sky a brilliant blue overhead. Mrs. Chen helped Teresa into her dress, and Martha Webb did her hair, pinning it up with small white flowers that Samuel had somehow managed to find. When Teresa looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back, radiant, happy, hopeful in a way she had not been since before her mother died. The wedding was held in the small church at the edge of town, with the circuit preacher who came through once a month presiding. The church was packed with what seemed like half of Goldfield ranch hands and miners, shopkeepers and their wives, even a few of the people whose names had been on Teresa's debt board. Samuel stood at the front in his best suit, his hair slicked back, looking nervous and proud and so handsome that Teresa's breath caught when she saw him. Henderson walked her down the aisle, gruff but kind, and placed her hand in Samuel's with a whispered, "Take care of her, boy." "Always," Samuel promised, his eyes never leaving Teresa's face. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. They exchanged vows that they had written themselves, Teresa promising to trust and to let herself be loved, Samuel promising to cherish and to always be honest. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Teresa with such joy and tenderness that several of the women in attendance started crying. The reception was held at the saloon, which Teresa had decorated with evergreen branches and candles. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with the cake, 3 layers of vanilla with raspberry filling. There was dancing and music and more happiness than Teresa had ever thought possible. She danced with Samuel until her feet hurt, then danced some more, not wanting the night to end. When they finally left for their cabin, it was well after midnight. Samuel lifted Teresa onto his horse and mounted behind her, keeping her wrapped in his coat against the cold. They rode slowly through the quiet town, past the saloon where a few late-night drinkers were still celebrating, past the church where they had promised themselves to each other, out into the desert where the stars blazed overhead like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The cabin was warm when they arrived, Samuel having arranged for someone to keep the fire going. He carried Teresa over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in front of the fireplace. "Hello, Mrs. Merritt," he said softly, framing her face with his hands. "Hello, Mr. Merritt." Teresa reached up and pulled him down for a kiss. "I love you so much. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." They made love for the first time that night, gentle and passionate and full of discovery. Samuel treated Teresa like she was made of glass and fire both, worshipping every inch of her, making her feel beautiful and cherished and safe. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, talking quietly about their dreams and their future, making plans that stretched out into years and decades. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked, stroking her hair. "Happier than I have ever been," Teresa said truthfully. "Sometimes I cannot believe this is real, that I get to have this. It is real, and it is forever." He kissed her forehead. "We are going to build such a good life together, Teresa. I can feel it. So can I." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Teresa's last thought before sleep claimed her was that she had spent so long keeping score of what people owed her that she had almost missed the greatest gift of all, being loved completely, debt-free and clear-hearted. The first year of their marriage was everything Teresa could have hoped for and more. The saloon continued to thrive, and Teresa proved to be just as good at running it with kindness as she had been with strictness. She extended credit to people who needed it, and found that most of them paid her back, and the few who did not, she wrote off without bitterness. Samuel built his horse herd slowly but surely, developing a reputation for breeding quality animals and dealing honestly. He continued to work part-time for Henderson while building his own enterprise, saving money for the day when they could expand the cabin and maybe add a barn. They settled into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease. Teresa learned to cook Samuel's favorite meals, and he learned when she needed space and when she needed to be held. They argued occasionally. Teresa's stubborn streak had not disappeared entirely, and Samuel could be maddeningly patient when she wanted him to fight back, but they always made up before bed, holding to their promise never to let anger fester. By late summer, Teresa suspected she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Samuel, wanting to be sure, wanting to give him news that was solid and real. When she finally told him one evening in September, exactly a year after their first dinner together, he picked her up and spun her around just like he had the day she broke the debt board. "We are going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Teresa asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy? Teresa, I am over the moon. We are going to have a family." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with such tenderness that Teresa started to cry, hormones and happiness overwhelming her all at once. They spent the evening making plans, arguing cheerfully over names, imagining what their child might look like. The pregnancy was not easy. Teresa was sick for the first 3 months, and the Nevada heat made the later months uncomfortable. But Samuel was there through all of it, holding her hair when she was sick, rubbing her swollen feet, talking to her belly about the horses and the ranch, and how much they were going to love their baby. Their son was born on a warm May evening in 1886, right in their cabin with Mrs. Chen attending. Samuel held Teresa's hand through the whole thing, and when the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, he cut the cord with shaking hands and placed their son in Teresa's arms with tears streaming down his face. "He is beautiful," Samuel whispered, "just like his mother." "He looks like you," Teresa said, studying the baby's features. "He has your nose." They named him Thomas after Teresa's father with the middle name Samuel. Little Thomas was a good baby, easy and happy, and Teresa found herself falling in love all over again with her son, with her husband, with the life they had built together. The saloon became more of an inn, as Teresa had once dreamed. She hired help to run it while she was home with Thomas, and Samuel's horse business grew successful enough that he could finally quit working for Henderson entirely. They expanded the cabin, adding rooms for their growing family, planning for the future with confidence and joy. When Thomas was 2, Teresa became pregnant again. Their daughter, Elizabeth Mee, was born in the winter of 1888, fierce and loud where Thomas had been easy and quiet. She had Teresa's dark hair and Samuel's gray eyes, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger from day one. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work, and the sweet chaos of raising children. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, gentle boy who loved horses and followed his father everywhere. Elizabeth was bold and fearless, climbing trees and getting into mischief, keeping Teresa on her toes. In 1890, they had another son, William, who was quiet like Thomas but mischievous like Elizabeth, the perfect combination of his siblings. Teresa sometimes thought about the woman she had been before Samuel, the one who had kept every debt scratched into a wooden board, who had trusted no one and believed in nothing but hard work and payment owed. She felt almost sorry for that woman, for all the years she had spent protecting herself from the very thing that had brought her the most joy, opening her heart and letting someone in. The old debt board was long gone, burned in a trash fire years ago. But sometimes Teresa would see people in town who had owed her money, back then Martha Webb, now a grandmother herself, Tommy Carson, married and running his own business, Pete and Dutch, still working the ranches but older and wiser. Most of them had never paid back what they owed, and Teresa found she did not care. The money had mattered so much less than she had thought it did. What mattered was this Samuel coming in from the barn with Thomas and William trailing behind him, all 3 of them laughing about something. Elizabeth demanding that her mother tell her a story, the more adventurous the better. The 4 of them gathered around the dinner table, talking about their day, making plans for tomorrow. The way Samuel still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, even after years of marriage and 3 children and the inevitable weathering of time. What mattered was the life they had built, debt-free and full of love. On a warm evening in June of 1892, 8 years after Teresa had broken the debt board in half, the whole family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. The children were playing in the yard. Thomas was 10 now, Elizabeth 4, and William 2. Samuel sat next to Teresa on the bench he had built, his arm around her shoulders, both of them content to sit in comfortable silence. "You ever regret it?" Teresa asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Tying yourself to a woman who was so closed off and difficult." Samuel turned to look at her, surprise and love in his eyes. "Not for a single second. You were not difficult, Teresa. You were careful, and you had every right to be. I am honored that you chose to trust me, to let me in." "You made it easy," Teresa said, leaning into him. "You were patient when I needed patience and persistent when I needed pushing. You saw past my defenses to who I really was underneath. I saw a woman who had been hurt and chose strength instead of bitterness. I saw someone worth knowing, worth loving." He kissed her temple. "And I have never regretted that choice. Not once." They sat together watching their children play, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Teresa felt a peace so profound it made her want to cry. This was what happiness looked like, not the absence of struggle or difficulty, but the presence of love and family and someone to share the burden with. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For seeing me. For loving me. For breaking through my walls and showing me what life could be like if I was brave enough to trust." "You gave me just as much," Samuel said. "You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You made me believe I could be the kind of man I always wanted to be." Teresa turned and kissed him, long and sweet, right there on the porch where their children could see. When they pulled apart, Elizabeth was making exaggerated gagging noises, and Thomas was trying to cover William's eyes while fighting a grin. "Mama and Papa are kissing again," Elizabeth announced to no one in particular. "They do that a lot." "Because we love each other," Samuel called out. "And because you three better get used to it, because we are going to be kissing when we are old and gray, and you are all grown up with families of your own." The children ran off shrieking with laughter, and Teresa settled back against Samuel's shoulder, content and complete. Somewhere in her memory was the ghost of a wooden board covered with debts and grievances, a catalog of every time someone had failed to keep their word. But it was faint now, faded by years of love and forgiveness and the sweet knowledge that most things mattered more than being right or being paid back. What mattered was this moment, this family, this life they had built together from the broken pieces of who they used to be. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Thomas grew into a fine young man who took over most of the horse breeding operation, developing an even better eye for bloodlines than his father. Elizabeth, true to her fierce nature, became a teacher in town, determined to educate the children of Goldfield and give them opportunities she felt everyone deserved. William split his time between helping with the horses and working at the saloon turned in, which had become the most successful business in town under Teresa's management. Samuel and Teresa grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced hardships: a drought that nearly wiped out the horse herd, a fire that damaged part of the inn, the death of old man Henderson, who had become something of a father figure to them both. But they faced everything together, and somehow that made even the difficult times bearable. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in December of 1904, Samuel surprised Teresa with a gift. It was a new wooden board, polished and beautiful, but instead of debts scratched into it, there were names and dates carved in careful script: their wedding date, the births of their children, the day they bought the land, the day the inn opened, every happy milestone of their life together. I wanted you to have something to keep track of the good things, Samuel said, his hair now threaded with silver, his face lined with age but his eyes still that same steady gray. Because there have been so many good things, Teresa. So many moments worth remembering. Teresa traced the carved names with her fingers, tears spilling down her cheeks. It is perfect. You are perfect. I am far from perfect, but I love you perfectly, and that is what matters. They hung the new board in a place of honor in their home, and over the years it filled with more carvings the births of grandchildren, the marriages of their children, anniversaries and achievements, and all the sweet, ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. Teresa never did make another debt board for the inn. She continued to extend credit when people needed it, and most paid her back, and those who did not, she forgave. She had learned that kindness was not weakness, that trust was not foolishness, that sometimes the richest life was one lived with an open heart and open hands. On a warm summer evening in 1910, when Teresa was 52 and Samuel 54, they sat on their porch surrounded by children and grandchildren. Thomas had married a lovely woman named Catherine and had 3 children of his own. Elizabeth had married a schoolteacher from Sacramento and had twin daughters. William was courting a girl from town and would likely be married within the year. Samuel reached over and took Teresa's hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades together. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. "You walked into my saloon covered in dust and asked for whiskey," Teresa said, smiling at the memory. "I thought you were just another cowboy passing through. And you were the most beautiful, fierce woman I had ever seen. I fell in love with you right then, though it took me months to work up the courage to tell you. I am glad you did. I am glad you did not give up on me, even when I was so determined to keep everyone at a distance. You were worth the wait, worth every moment." Samuel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I would do it all again, exactly the same way, just to end up here with you." Teresa leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun set over the Nevada desert they both loved. She thought about the girl she had been, angry and afraid, keeping careful score of every debt and every disappointment. She thought about the woman she had become, loved and loving, rich in all the ways that truly mattered. The debt board that had once defined her life was long gone, snapped clean in half by her own hands in a moment of courage and hope. In its place was a life built on trust and forgiveness, and the radical belief that most people, anyway, were doing their best. And she had Samuel to thank for that, this steady, kind man who had seen past her defenses and loved her anyway. As the stars began to appear overhead and their grandchildren chased fireflies in the yard, Teresa squeezed Samuel's hand and whispered, "Thank you for showing me what it means to be free." "Thank you for letting me love you," Samuel whispered back. And they sat together in the gathering darkness, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that was richer than any debt collected, any score kept, any careful accounting could ever capture. They had learned that love was not about keeping track of who owed what, but about giving freely and trusting that it would be returned. And it had been, 1,000-fold, in the form of children and grandchildren and decades of happiness, and the sweet certainty of being exactly where they were meant to be. The story of the debt board became something of a legend in Goldfield. People told their children about the woman who had kept careful score of everything owed to her, until a cowboy came along and showed her a different way to live. Some versions of the story made Samuel into a hero who saved Teresa from herself. Others made Teresa into a villain who learned to be kind. But those who knew them best understood the truth that they had saved each other. 2 wounded people who found healing in love and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. As the years rolled on toward the end of their lives, Samuel and Teresa never lost the spark that had drawn them together. They held hands like newlyweds, still kissed in front of their scandalized grandchildren, still looked at each other with the wonder of people who could not quite believe their good fortune. When Samuel fell ill in the winter of 1916, Teresa nursed him with the same fierce devotion she brought to everything she loved. "I am not ready to let you go," she told him one cold December night, holding his hand as he lay in their bed. "I need more time with you." "You have had me for 32 years, Samuel said, his voice weak but his eyes still clear and full of love. "That is more than most people get, Teresa, more than I ever dreamed of having. It is not enough. It will never be enough." "Then carry me in your heart," Samuel whispered, reaching up to touch her face. "And know that every moment with you was a gift. Breaking that debt board and showing you that life could be different, that was the best thing I ever did." "Loving you was the best thing I ever did," Teresa said, tears streaming down her face. Samuel smiled, that crooked smile she had fallen in love with so many years ago. "Then we are both lucky, are we not?" He slipped away quietly in the early hours of the morning, with Teresa holding his hand and their children gathered around. The grief was crushing, a weight that threatened to break her. But Teresa had learned from Samuel how to carry difficult things with grace, and she did not break. She mourned deeply and honestly, but she did not close off her heart. That would have dishonored everything he had taught her. At his funeral, Teresa spoke about the cowboy who had walked into her saloon covered in dust and somehow seen past all her defenses to the woman underneath. She told their children and grandchildren how he had given her a journal for recording good things, how he had proposed right after she broke the debt board, how he had spent 32 years showing her what love looked like in action. "Your father taught me that keeping score is a poor way to live," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He taught me that trust is not weakness, that forgiveness is not foolishness, that opening your heart is the bravest thing you can do. He taught me to love freely, without counting the cost, and in doing so he gave me a life richer than any ledger could ever capture." Teresa lived another 6 years after Samuel's death, years filled with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had built something lasting. The inn continued to thrive under William's management. Thomas's horses were now sought after throughout Nevada and beyond. Elizabeth's school had educated hundreds of children and changed countless lives. On her deathbed in 1922, surrounded by 3 generations of family, Teresa's last words were about Samuel. "Tell him I kept my promise," she whispered. "Tell him I stayed open, stayed loving, stayed brave. Tell him I am coming home." And then she closed her eyes and went to join her cowboy, the man who had snapped her debt board clean in half, and in doing so, had set her free to love and be loved in return. The family buried her next to Samuel in the Goldfield cemetery under a headstone that read, "Teresa Merritt, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She learned to keep track of blessings instead of debts." And below, on Samuel's stone, "Samuel Merritt, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He taught love without keeping score." Their story lived on in the family, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of the hurts and grievances that weigh you down. That forgiveness is not about letting others off the hook, but about freeing yourself to live fully. That love, real love, is not about keeping score but about giving freely and trusting that it will be returned. The wooden board with all the good memories carved into it became a family heirloom, passed down through the years. Each generation added their own milestones, their own joys, their own proof that Samuel and Teresa's legacy of love without ledgers continued. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, their descendants would run their fingers over the oldest carvings, those first dates and names from 1884, when a stubborn saloon keeper and a patient cowboy found each other and built something that would last for generations. The debt board that Teresa had kept for 3 years, the one Samuel had watched her snap in half on that pivotal November day in 1884, was never forgotten. But it was remembered not as a symbol of her hardness, but as a symbol of her courage, the courage to let go, to trust, to believe that there was a better way to live. And in the end, that courage had been rewarded 1,000-fold, in love and family and a life well lived. Their story became a part of Goldfield's history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But for those who had known them, who had seen the way Samuel looked at Teresa like she hung the moon, who had watched Teresa soften and bloom under his patient love, it was not legend at all. It was simply the truth that sometimes it takes the right person to show us that the walls we have built to protect ourselves are actually the bars of our own prison. And that breaking free, while terrifying, is the only way to truly live. In the end, the story of Teresa and Samuel Merritt was a love story, pure and simple. It was a story about two people who found each other in the harsh landscape of the Wild West and chose to build something tender and lasting. It was about debt and forgiveness, about keeping score and letting go, about the courage it takes to trust and the rewards that come when you do. And it was about a wooden board, scratched with the names of everyone who owed the saloon keeper money, that a cowboy snapped clean in half, not out of anger or disrespect, but as a symbol that there was another way to live, a better way. A way that led not to bitter isolation, but to love and family, and the sweet satisfaction of a life well lived. Teresa Paulson had kept every debt scratched into that wooden board, had guarded it like a treasure, had let it define her for 3 long years. And then Samuel Merritt had come along, and with his patience and his kindness and his steady, unwavering love, he had shown her that she could let it go, that she could snap it clean in half and walk away, free to build a future based not on what people owed her, but on what they could give each other freely. It was a lesson their children learned, and their children's children, and all the generations that followed. The Merritts became known in Goldfield and beyond as people who were fair but kind, who worked hard but loved harder, who believed in second chances and fresh starts. They built a legacy not of wealth or power, but of love, the kind of love that Samuel and Teresa had discovered together, forged in the harsh beauty of the Nevada desert and passed down like the most precious inheritance. And so the story ended not with bitterness or regret, but with love triumphant, with a family gathered around their matriarch as she breathed her last, carrying with them the lessons she and Samuel had learned and lived. With great-grandchildren, who would never know their great-grandparents personally, but who would grow up hearing stories about the debt board and the cowboy and the saloon keeper who learned to love without keeping score. It was a happy ending, the kind that Teresa had once thought was only for fools and dreamers. But Samuel had shown her that she could be both wise and hopeful, both strong and soft, both careful and trusting. He had shown her that the best life was not one lived in isolation, carefully tallying every slight and every debt, but one lived in community and family and love. And in the end, when Teresa's eyes closed for the last time and she went to join her beloved Samuel in whatever came after, she went with a full heart and no regrets. She had lived, truly lived, in a way she never could have if she had kept that board on the wall and let it define her forever. The debt board was gone, snapped in half and burned to ashes decades ago. But the love it had led to the family it had helped create when Teresa finally let it go, that love lived on, growing and expanding with each new generation. A testament to two people who had been brave enough to choose trust over fear, love over bitterness, and each other over the safety of their walls. That was the true ending of their story. Not the board, not the debts, not the careful accounting of who owed what, but the love, always the love that Samuel had offered so patiently and that Teresa had finally been brave enough to accept. The love that had carried them through 3 decades of marriage and had outlasted even death, living on in their children and their children's children and all the lives they touched. It was a good ending, a happy ending. The kind of ending that Teresa Paulson, who had once believed only in hard work and payment owed, would have said was impossible. But Samuel Merritt had made it possible, just by being himself, just by seeing her, loving her, and patiently waiting for her to be brave enough to love him back. And she had been brave enough, and that had made all the difference.